He became pregnant his own daughter twice before the age of 15. This is the story of Willard Dawson, the most incestuous father ever exposed in the state of Georgia, a case that shocked the small Rabun Gap community in the 1970s. A family isolated in the Appalachian Mountains, where dark secrets remained buried by generations until the inevitable collapse revealed a reality that many would rather have never known. Rabun Gap, Georgia, 1978. A mountainous region, where time seemed to run more slowly than in the rest of the country. Isolated communities maintained their own traditions, protected by deep valleys and precarious roads that made it difficult to access outsiders. It was in this scenario that the Dawson family built their own reality, away from external looks and the laws that governed conventional society. Willard Dawson, 42 in 1978, was a descendant of one of the first families to settle in that region in the early 19th century. His ancestors had arrived as pioneers, based on the tall lands where they built a small rural property. Over generations, Dawson became known for their isolation and distrust of strangers, rarely coming down to the city except to buy essential supplies. Dawson's property was approximately 12 kilometers from the nearest city, at the end of a dirt road that became impassable during periods of heavy rain. The main house, a two-story wooden structure built by Willard's grandfather, was visibly deteriorated. A partially collapsed barn, a well of water and some areas of cultivation completed the property, where Willard, his wife Martha, and his 5 children lived. Martha Dawson, born Martha Collins, was Willard's second-degree cousin. The two had married when she was only 16 years old, following a family standard of unions between relatives dating back to generations. Martha had an erased countenance, eyes always low, and rarely spoke in the presence of strangers. At 38, it appeared to be much older, the result of a life of deprivation and the physical and emotional wear of multiple pregnancies in precarious conditions. The couple had 5 children, 3 boys, Jacob, 19, Thomas, 17, and Samuel, 10, and 2 girls, Sarah, 15, and Rebecca, 8. All had similar physical characteristics, below-average stature, asymmetrical features, and obvious dental problems. Jacob and Thomas already showed signs of erratic behavior, alternating between periods of apathy and explosions of unexplained aggression. The story we are about to report began to surface when Sarah Dawson, then 15, was taken to the regional hospital after passing out during a rare visit to the city with his father. What doctors discovered that day would open the doors for an investigation that would reveal decades of a practice that modern society considers one of the largest taboos: improper relationships between members of the same family, resulting in children with serious development problems. Check it out if it is already subscribed to this channel. If not, subscribe now so as not to lose impactful stories that reveal the darkest secrets of American families. These are truths that few have the courage to tell, but they need to be known to never be repeated. Dr. Richard Thornton still clearly remembers the day Sarah Dawson arrived at Clayton's Community Hospital. It was a cold morning of October 1978, and the 15-year-old was unconscious when her father carried her into the emergency room. Willard Dawson explained that his daughter had passed out while carrying shopping, and that it was not the first time that has happened in recent weeks. "There was something about his behavior that bothered me from the first moment," said Dr. Thornton years later. "The way he avoided eye contact, how he insisted on being by the maker, as it seemed nervous when we suggest you have more detailed tests." The initial exam revealed that Sarah was extremely anemic and dehydrated, but it was during the most complete assessment that the truth began to emerge. The teenager was pregnant, approximately in the 5th month of pregnancy. When confronted with this information, Willard was visibly agitated, insisting that he should take his daughter home immediately. It was at this critical moment that Nurse Elaine Parker, with over 20 years of experience in delicate cases, intervened. Realizing signs of possible vulnerability, she was able to create a private moment with Sarah, while her father was referred to fill administrative forms. "When we finally stayed alone, I asked her about the pregnancy," Elaine reported later. "She looked at me with her empty eyes I've ever seen and said simply, 'Dad said it's like that with all the girls in our family.'" This DCL action, done almost in a whisper, was the first indication of the horror that was happening on the property of the Dawson. Upon noticing the severity of the situation, the medical team immediately called the local authorities. Sheriff David Miller, who commanded the Rabun County Police Department at the time, arrived at the hospital less than an hour later. Willard was arrested for questioning, while Sarah was kept under medical observation. The authorities obtained a search warrant for the property of Dawson, where they found Martha and the other 4 children. The house revealed alarming living conditions. Although there was electricity from a diesel generator, there was no running water or proper sewage system. The rooms were scarcely furnished, with mattresses scattered across the floor in some rooms. There was little food in the pantry, especially canned and some vegetables from the family garden. The most disturbing, however, was finding a girl of about 2 years hidden in a room at the back of the house. The child, who was not in any official record, had several worrying physical characteristics: head disproportionate to the body, very remote eyes, and difficulties to move and communicate. Martha Dawson, when asked about the child, revealed among tears that this was Emma, daughter of Sarah, and Emma's father, according to Martha, was Willard himself. Preliminary investigations revealed that Sarah had given loose Emma when she was only 13 years old. The girl had never been officially registered, had never received medical attention, and her existence was unknown to any authority. Sarah was now pregnant again, also from her father. As the investigation advanced, an even more disturbing picture began to emerge. School records showed that Sarah had attended the local school only until she was 10, when Willard stated that she would educate her at home, something that never happened. The 3 boys had also abandoned the school early, while Rebecca, the youngest daughter, had never been enrolled. Neighbors from the nearest properties, even if distant a few kilometers, reported that they rarely saw members of the Dawson family. They appeared in town maybe 3 or 4 times a year, always Willard with 1 or 2 of his children, never the whole family, a local merchant reported. They bought large amounts of supplies and returned to the mountains. If you tried to pull conversation, Willard cut fast and left. The investigation also revealed that the family survived mainly from the occasional sale of animal skins that Willard and the older children hunted, as well as a small agricultural subsistence production. Ancient documents showed that Dawson had received a significant inheritance from a distant relative in the early 1960s, which explained how they could maintain property despite the limited income. But the darker aspect was just beginning to be revealed. The family standards of consanguinity dated at least 3 previous generations. Ancient county records indicated that Willard's grandparents were first-degree cousins, as did their parents. This pattern of relationships between close relatives had created an extremely closed genetic lineage, resulting in a number of physical and cognitive problems that became more evident with each new generation. As Sarah Dawson recovered her strength in the hospital, her story began to take shape through the fragments of information she shared with the assistant designated for her case, Eleanor Winters. With patience and sensitivity, Eleanor managed to gradually gain the teenager's confidence, who had been created to distrust anyone outside the family. "The world outside is dangerous and full of people who want to separate us," Sarah repeated, clearly reproducing what had been taught her throughout her life. "Dad always said that only within our family could we be truly safe." The reality that emerged from these conversations was deeply disturbing. According to Sarah, when she turned 12, her father began to treat her differently. He explained that in their family, it was tradition for parents to teach their daughters what their adult life would be like. Martha, her mother, had been quietly complicit, having herself from similar experience with her father decades earlier. When Sarah pregnant for the first time, at 13, there was no search for medical attention. Martha, using knowledge transmitted for generations, acted as a midwife in Emma's birth. When asked how he felt when giving birth, Sarah demonstrated a disturbing lack of understanding of what had really happened. "Dad said I was special because I managed to give the family a new member perfect," she explained with devastating simplicity. "He said Emma was more perfect than the others because she came straight from him to me." Sarah's medical and psychological evaluations revealed the devastating impact of the isolation and horror she had lived. Although he was 15 years old chronologically, his cognitive and emotional development was significantly late. She showed difficulty in understanding abstract concepts, had a limited and more worrying vocabulary, showed no awareness that what had suffered was wrong. If you are feeling deeply impacted by this story, you are not alone. Leave in the comments "Justice to Sarah" to show that we cannot tolerate that children grow in environments of exploration and negligence. Your voice is important for these stories to never be forgotten. Meanwhile, the investigation into the other family members revealed more layers of this disturbing case. Jacob and Thomas, the older children, showed clear signs of cognitive deficit. Psychological evaluations indicated that both had intellectual development equivalent to that of children aged 9 to 10, despite being 19 and 17 years old, respectively. Samuel, 10, and Rebecca, 8, also showed significant delays in development, as well as health problems such as hearing difficulties, congenital heart problems, and dental malformations. Emma, the daughter of Sarah and Willard, underwent a series of medical evaluations that confirmed the initial suspicions. The 2-year-old girl had multiple conditions resulting from consanguinity. In addition to the physical characteristics already observed, heart problems, low immunity, and significant delay in neuromotor development were detected. Doctors estimated that she would probably never develop cognitive abilities beyond those of a 4- or 5-year-old child, even in adulthood. Martha Dawson, when she finally started talking to the authorities, revealed that her own story mirrored Sarah's. Born Martha Collins, she was the daughter of a first-degree cousin of Willard's father. At age 15, he was offered to Willard as his wife, continuing a cycle that, according to her, was considered normal within that family branch. "My mother told me that this was how things were always done," Martha explained in a recorded statement. She said that keeping the blood of the pure family was important, that mixing with strangers brought weakness. The investigation revealed that this thought had deep historical roots. Dawson's ancestors came from the Scottish Appalachians region in the early 19th century, bringing beliefs about the importance of maintaining pure family strains. Isolated in the mountains of Georgia, far from the social and cultural evolution of the rest of the country, these distorted beliefs not only survived, but intensified over generations. The most alarming discovery came when the investigators found diaries belonging to Willard's grandfather, written between 1910 and 1935. In these diaries, Edwin Dawson described in detail disturbing his vision on preservation of family purity and how he had instructed his son, Willard's father, to continue this practice. The diaries also contained almost clinical observations about the results of these unions, noting physical characteristics of born children and which were considered successful or flaws. These documents provided crucial evidence that the practice of consanguinity in the Dawson family was not only an isolated case involving Willard, but a deliberate system maintained by generations, resulting in increasingly compromised genetic alignment. Willard Dawson's trial began in March 1979 and quickly became one of the most notorious cases in Georgia's legal history. The prosecutor, led by Howard Reeves, presented a meticulously built case, supported by physical evidence, medical records, and the devastating testimonies of Dawson family members. The Rayburn County Court, a red brick building built at the beginning of the century, could barely accommodate the public interest in the case. Journalists from Atlanta and even national publications accompanied each development, while Clayton's small community tried to process the fact that such a horror had existed for so long, so close to them. Willard remained impassive throughout the process, rarely showing any emotion. His defense lawyer, a state-designated professional who clearly struggled with the nature of the case, tried to build an argument based on his client's cultural isolation and ignorance over modern social laws and norms. "My client is the product of generations of isolation in the mountains," argued the lawyer. "He was created believing that these practices was normally within your family, without access to proper education that could have corrected this distorted view." This argument, however, was quickly dismantled by the prosecution, which had evidence that Willard frequently went to the city, had a functional radio on the property, and had even worked briefly in a local sawmill in the early 1960s before inheriting family property. He had sufficient knowledge of the outside world to understand that his actions were convinced by society, argued Prosecutor Reeves. The most impactful testimony came from Martha Dawson. After months of psychological counseling, she finally managed to break decades of conditioning and talk about her experience. In a trembling voice, she described how she was handed over to Willard as a teenager, how she was kept isolated, and how she eventually became a silent accomplice of the horrors perpetuated against her own daughter. "I knew it was wrong," she admitted, tears running down her face for years. "But when you spend your lifetime being taught that questioning means treason to the family, you lose the ability to oppose. I failed my daughter, and I will never forgive myself for it." The medical and psychological experts who witnessed explained in detail the devastating effects of continued consanguinity throughout generations. Dr. Lawrence Freeman, a geneticist at the University of Emory, presented a detailed study of the Dawson family tree, demonstrating how the increasingly restricted genetic pool had resulted in a concentration of harmful recessive genes. "What we see in the Dawson family is a textual example of the dangers of endogamy," explained Dr. Freeman. "When close relatives have children together, the likelihood that harmful recessive genes manifest themselves dramatically increases. In the case of this family, where this practice has occurred by at least 4 consecutive generations, we see a waterfall of genetic problems that have become progressively more severe." The doctor described how the problems observed in Willard and Martha's older children, from cognitive deficits to heart problems and physical malformations, were direct consequences of this pattern of consanguinity. But he was discussing the case of Emma, the daughter of Sarah and Willard, that her testimony became even more impactful. "This child represents what we call extreme endogamic depression," he explained. "When a father has improper relationships with his own daughter, who is already the product of a consanguineous lineage, the result is an even greater concentration of problematic recessive genes. The chances of serious development and health problems exceed 70%. The medical reports about Sarah's second pregnancy, still underway during the trial, indicated that the fetus already had signs of multiple development complications. The doctors predicted that if pregnancy reached the end, the child would probably have even more severe conditions than Emma. As trial advanced, the community began to question how such a situation could exist for so long without intervention. Local school officials were criticized for not properly investigated when children Dawson stopped attending classes. Social assistance authorities faced questions about the lack of accompaniment visits to the isolated family with multiple children. Prosecutor Reeves directed part of his accusation to the systemic failure that allowed the Dawson tragedy to continue for generations. "This is not just a man's judgment," he declared on his final argument. "It is the trial of a look that closed the eyes, a system that failed to protect the most vulnerable, and a culture of silence that allowed the unthinkable to happen just a few kilometers from where we are sitting today." After 7 days of trial and only 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with the verdict. Willard Dawson was considered guilty of all accusations. Judge William Hartford, visibly shaken by the case, issued the maximum sentence permitted by the Georgia law at the time: 3 consecutive 25-year prison sentences, ensuring that Willard would never leave prison. 45 years have passed since the Dawson case shocked Georgia and the entire country. The consequences of that terrible history continue to reverberate, not only for survivors, but also as a powerful reminder of the dangers of extreme isolation and community neglect. Willard Dawson died at Georgia's State Penitentiary in 1997 at age 61, never expressing remorse for his actions. Martha, after serving 5 years in prison for complicity, spent the rest of her life in a community assisted to people with mental disorders, died in 2012 of heart complications, another common result of generations of consanguinity. The fate of the children Dawson followed several ways, all marked by trauma and the genetic consequences of their birth. Jacob and Thomas, older children, have never been able to live independently due to their cognitive limitations. Both spent decades in institutions for adults with disabilities, with Thomas died in 2010 due to renal failure, and Jacob still living under supervised care. Samuel, who was only 10 years old when his family was discovered, had the opportunity to receive specialized education and intensive care. Although he has never completely overcome his cognitive deficits, he eventually managed to learn a craft and lives today in an assisted community where he works in an adapted carpentry workshop. Rebecca, the youngest daughter perhaps, was the one who best responded to the intervention. Adopted by a family of university professors, he received special education and extensive therapeutic support. Despite his learning difficulties, he was able to complete the equivalent of high school, and today works as an assistant in a local library, having found stability and a significant degree of independence. Sarah Dawson, whose involuntary courage exposed the case, faced a long and difficult path of recovery. The second pregnancy resulted in a boy with multiple serious conditions who died before completing his first year of life. Sarah spent years in intensive psychological treatment, gradually understanding the magnitude of what she had suffered. At 19, she took an extraordinary step. She decided to talk publicly about her experience. In an interview with an educational documentary filmmaker in 1982, Sarah, then with a clearer understanding of what he had lived, expressed his desire that his story would serve as a warning. "I don't want anyone else growing up thinking that it was normal or acceptable," she said at the time. "I want people to understand that isolation is not protection, it is prison." Emma, the daughter of Sarah and Willard, grew up under specialized care, facing multiple medical and developmental challenges. Despite the pessimistic predictions, she exceeded some expectations, managing to develop basic communication skills and some degree of independence in everyday activities. However, the cognitive development equivalent to a 6-year-old child has never exceeded. Emma died in 2001 at the age of 25 due to congenital cardiac complications. Sarah eventually managed to build a life for herself. After years of therapy and remedial education, she married an assistant teacher she met during a rehabilitation program. There was no more children, a conscious decision based on both his trauma and the genetic risks he carried. He dedicated his adult life to volunteer in family isolation prevention programs and detecting signal signs. Dawson's property in the Georgia mountains was eventually demolished by order of the county, which considered the site a monument to human tragedy. The area has been reforested and today is part of a nature reserve, without any indication of the horror that existed there for decades. The most important legacy of the Dawson case, however, was its impact on public policies and social conscience. After the trial, the state of Georgia completely revised their protection protocols for child and monitoring families in remote areas. New laws have been implemented, requiring regular checks from families who opted for home education and creating a more robust school abandonment detection system. The medical community also learned valuable lessons from the case. The Clayton Community Hospital has developed specific protocols to identify signs of improper relationships, and the training of health professionals across the region began to include modules on the detection of genetic problems that may indicate consanguinity. Genetics experts have extensively studied Dawson's medical records, documenting scientifically accurately the devastating effects of multiple generations of consanguinity. These studies are now used in educational programs around the world, clearly illustrating why taboos against relationships between close relatives exist in virtually all human cultures. In 2008, a prevention and education center received the name Project Sarah in honor of Sarah Dawson and his survival journey. The center, located in Atlanta, offers educational resources and support for improper relationship survivors, as well as training professionals to identify signals from families at risk. Sarah passed away in 2019 at the age of 56, leaving a legacy of courage and transformation. In his funeral, dozens of professionals who had been inspired by his history to work on protecting children vulnerable. One of his last wishes was that his story was to be told not as sensationalism, but as a painful and necessary reminder that extreme isolation can create spaces where unthinkable it becomes reality. Dawson's history reminds us that even in the deepest shadows of society, there is the possibility of intervention, healing, and change. It also reminds us of the collective responsibility that we have to be aware of the signs that something is wrong, not to look away from discomfort, and ensuring that no child grows up believing that suffering is normal or acceptable. Check it out if it is already subscribed to this channel. If not, subscribe now to access deep investigations into cases that society prefer to forget, but we need to remember to prevent them from repeating. If you watched so far, it is because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here," so I can meet you and know who really likes the stories here on the channel. Don't forget to enjoy this video and share it with people who value knowing the truth, however difficult it is. This was the story of Willard Dawson, the most incestuous father ever exposed in Georgia, and the lives that were forever altered by generations of isolation and consanguinity. A story that reminds us that even in the most remote communities, no one should be beyond the reach of protection, education, and law.